Donald Trump is coming back as President of the United States, but the world has changed since he left the office in early 2021. What will he do about the Russian war against Ukraine, the biggest war on the European continent since the Second World War? Our guest is H.R. McMaster, former National Security Advisor to Donald Trump, a retired Lieutenant General, a military historian, and now a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. General McMaster, welcome to Deutsche Welle.
Roman, hey, it's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. We'll come to Donald Trump in a second, but let's start with this. In your recent book, At War with Ourselves, My Tour of Duty in the Trump White House, here, you describe that you received the job offer from the Trump administration in February 2017, as you were about to present a study about Russian new generation warfare or hybrid warfare. Did you at that time expect Russia to attack Ukraine like it did in 2022? Some preparation were visible.
You know, I did, Roman. I thought if we didn't do enough to deter Russia, that Russia would organize and conduct a massive assault against Ukraine. And I tell the story in the book of really the pattern of Russian aggression that began really as soon as Putin came into office, but certainly with assassination attempts in Ukraine in 2003, of course, massive cyber attacks on Estonia. You know, of course, the Munich speech, kind of laid it out for everybody. The invasion of Georgia, the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014. I mean, it was pretty clear, what he was trying to achieve, which was to restore Russia to national greatness. And part of that plan was to subsume all of Ukraine. So I had concluded that in my job to designing the future U.S. Army, and then took that understanding with me into the job of National Security Advisor.
And still, when the war began, and in the days before, the United States were expecting Ukraine to last only 72 hours, 3 days, and then Ukraine would be just overrun by Russia. That was the major expectation. What went wrong? So why was the analysis on the American intelligence wrong?
Well, Rowan, I never believed that. I was asked right after the Russian invasion what would happen. And I said, the Russian invasion has failed already. There's no way that Russia can accomplish their objectives in Ukraine. And the reason is that the qualitative aspect of combat effectiveness. I mean, people like to count tanks and count fighter jets and count pieces of equipment. But what really matters is the level of training, the nature of the leadership, and the determination and will of soldiers. And of course, I think Ukrainian valor has a lot to do with the failed massive offensive in February of 2022. But also it has a lot to do with the training that was conducted. The Ukrainian army of 2022 was not the Ukrainian army of 2014. And of course, also important was the provision of lethal assistance to the Ukrainians, especially in the form of the Javelin anti-tank missile. And so all of these factors, plus Russian ineptitude. I mean, splitting the offensive on 3 to 4 axes, depending on how you count those axes of advance. And it seems like, Roman, I mean, they may have looked at the map, but maybe they forgot to look at the scale on the map, because the size of the forces that they committed were simply inadequate to the task, especially when you consider that cities swallow armies. And so from the very beginning, I thought this offensive is going to fail.
We'll talk about javelins that the Trump administration provided to Ukraine in a moment. Let's talk about Donald Trump. We are now speaking 1 week after the election, after we know that Donald Trump will be again US president. During the campaign, he has many times said that Russia would not have attacked Ukraine if he had been president. So does he have a point? What Donald Trump would have done differently, or to prevent that war, to prevent Russia from attacking?
Rome, we'll never know for sure, but I think it's possible that Putin would not have invaded Ukraine, because Trump, if anything, he's kind of unpredictable. And I think what the Biden administration did in the run-up to the massive reinvasion of Ukraine, this is really between August of 2021 and February of 2022, is they tried to reassure Putin, to allay what the Biden administration perceived as his security concerns. And that's a fundamental misunderstanding of Vladimir Putin. What drives Vladimir Putin is his aspiration to restore Russia to national greatness and his effort to reestablish the Russian Empire. All you have to do is read the long essay he supposedly authored in July or August of 2021. So what did the Biden administration do? They met with Putin in Geneva, laid out all of their red lines, which, you know what that sounds like to Putin? Well, I have a green light for everything else. And then we pulled our ships out of the Black Sea. We suspended lethal assistance to the Ukrainians. We listed all of the things we would not do to support the Ukrainians if they came under attack. And then we evacuated our embassy and all of our advisors. I mean, so it looks to me, in retrospect, Roman, like we greenlighted the offensive. So I don't think Trump would have done the same thing. Well, it's a question, open question. We'll never know the answer. What would Trump do, and would that have been adequate to deter Vladimir Putin? Of course, I think the question for all of us is, what if? What if we had provided Ukraine with the range of capabilities they have now before 2022? I think then Putin would not have invaded. I think what's important for all of us to recognize is what provokes Putin is the perception of weakness. And
this is exactly my next question. So you have advised Donald Trump on many issues, and you said that in your book you describe it, always negotiate from a position of strength, right? So should Ukraine negotiate with Russia now? Because this is what is on the table.
No, I don't think so. I think what should happen, and I mean, I think this is, I'm not, it's a long shot that this would happen, is to provide Ukraine with the full range of capabilities that they need, but also in sufficient capacity, right? A greater scale of support with all of the range of systems that they need to defend themselves and to generate more of an offensive capability. It's really important to recognize the Russians took more casualties in the last month than they had during any month of the war. I don't think that's sustainable. This is one of the reasons why they have North Korean troops there. So now's the time to give Ukraine the capabilities they need, because they're under physical duress with the sustained Russian offensive in the east in particular, and now maybe in the Kharkiv region as well. But also they're under psychological duress because President Trump and others who are coming into his administration have raised doubts about their willingness to sustain support for Ukraine. So I think now is a critical moment. And of course, you don't negotiate from a position of strength. And how can Ukrainians compromise after suffering so many horrors, and have been victimized in the way that they have, and, including just mass murder of civilians, the bombing of hospitals and schools, the kidnapping of children. I mean, so if take a look at it from the Ukrainian perspective, and I'm thinking of what G.K. Chesterton said, Roman. War's not the best way of settling differences, but it's the only way to ensure they're not settled for you.
Let's be specific, because Ukraine has presented its own plan, or victory plan, how they call it, just shortly before the election, also to Donald Trump. And one of the points on that plan is give us green light to use American, but also British or French cruise missiles to hit Russia deep inside, like 300 miles. So far, the Biden administration is not giving that green light. Would you advise Donald Trump to do that, and will he do it? What do you think?
I would advise him to do it, against military targets. I mean, it doesn't make any sense, does it? For them, the Ukrainians to leave unmolested if they have the capability to reach it, the bases from which the Russians are continuing this onslaught, with these glide bombs. And it makes no sense to allow Russian forces to marshal unmolested, or how about North Korean forces to marshal unmolested when you have these longer range capabilities. So yeah, I would advise him to do it.
What will he say? You know him well.
I think he'd probably say no at this point, because I think what's happening is it seems like President Trump and some of those people around him are still laboring under the delusion that Putin can somehow be conciliated and that there can somehow be some kind of an entente with him. The only thing that stops Putin is strength. I mean, we know that from now 2 decades of his authoritarian rule in Russia.
The key question for Ukraine and its partners in Europe, including Germany, is will Donald Trump try to force Ukraine to negotiate with Russia now on unfavorable terms, like giving up land? Or will he stop sending military aid to Ukraine, which is the key question? What is your answer or your expectation?
You know, my hope is that he won't do either one of those. I'm worried, as I'm sure many are in the United States and Europe, that he will do that. And we've heard this kind of idea that he'll entice Russia into negotiations by threatening to provide Ukraine, with the full range of capabilities they need and at a much larger scale, and then he'll coerce Ukraine to the negotiating table by threatening to withhold assistance. And of course, what this does is misunderstand the nature of war. Obtaining a favorable outcome in war requires convincing your enemy that your enemy's been defeated, or convincing your enemy, in this case Putin, that he cannot accomplish his objectives through the continued use of force. It also misunderstands that the degree to which what you do militarily is integrated with what you're trying to achieve politically. There is not a single example in history that I can think of a favorable diplomatic settlement that came out of an unfavorable situation on the ground militarily.
But there are people in the United States and also here in Europe who say, Russia can't be beaten. So Ukraine cannot win. Russia is too big and too strong. You disagree?
Russia is profoundly weak. Now, it doesn't mean they don't have elements of strength, right? Putin can still rattle the nuclear saber. He still has some cyber capabilities. He has some, long-range strike capabilities and so forth. But I mean, think about how fragile that regime is. Why isn't Putin going through a second round of mobilization? Because the Russian people won't stand for it. Why is he bringing in North Koreans? Because he has a real manpower problem. Think about the Wagner attack on Moscow. This is an ex-hot dog salesman and an ex-con who marches on Moscow, shoots down several aircraft, and they're cratering the roads in front of him. And so I think that, we take counsel of our fears. And Putin is a bully, a street thug, and a coward, I believe, all wrapped up into one. And the sooner, and he's an operator, right? He'll take whatever you give him. But when he meets stiff resistance from Europe and the United States, he'll back off. This is why I think, I know that Germany is going through a difficult transitional period politically, but I think we need the Europeans to step up, like the Poles and the Baltic states and the Nordic states have stood up, because you know what? They know what the threat is. It's right there on their border. I mean, Putin has not only continued this onslaught on Ukraine, he's annexed Belarus. He's flipped, the nature of the government in Georgia, in Slovakia. Look what he tried to do in Moldova to influence the referendum. Look what he's doing in Bulgaria now. I mean, so, he's not going to stop until he is stopped by a concerted military, diplomatic, and economic effort.
Speaking about the US aid, because US is the biggest supplier of weapons to Ukraine, the Vice President-elect, J.D. Vance, was speaking at the Munich Security Conference in February. And he said his idea is, yes, we support Ukraine, but we don't have enough weapons in the United States. We don't manufacture enough. Does he have a point?
Yeah, well, he has a point that is a risk, that you take to provide these capabilities. But hey, the Ukraine war was a wake-up call in terms of the need to dramatically increase our defense industrial bases across the free world, right? Look at what Rheinmetall and other companies are doing. And so the war in Ukraine, I think, has allowed us to begin to expand our defense industrial base. And, if Ukraine stops Russia, that means maybe we'll have the time that we can increase that defense industrial base, bolster our defenses across the free world and NATO in particular, and prevent World War III. I mean, I think that's what is at stake right now, is World War III, because it's not just Russia. It's this axis of aggressors. I think you could also think about Russia's war against Ukraine as China's proxy war against the West using Russia, because China is also helping to underwrite what Iran is doing across the greater Middle East. And what is China doing? While we have witnessed these cascading crises from Europe and across the Middle East, they've become extremely, much more aggressive in the Indo-Pacific region, laying claim to the ocean in the South China Sea, the blockades of Taiwan, the 7 acts of war in 1 month against the Philippines, a treaty ally of the United States, violation of Japanese airspace, what they've just done to Malaysia vessels and Vietnamese vessels. So China, I believe, is helping to orchestrate this axis of aggressors, which includes Iran and North Korea, as well as these 2 revanchist powers on the Eurasian landmass.
Speaking about Donald Trump's, what will he do next? People here in Europe keep guessing, what is his plan for Ukraine? Do you have maybe a better understanding? You worked for him, you are in the United States. What are your colleagues or experts are saying? What do you yourselves think?
Well, Roman, with him, it's really important to frame everything in context of U.S. interests. And that's what I hope some of the advisors around him can do. People like Marco Rubio, who is the nominee for the Secretary of State, who is an internationalist, right? He's not an isolationist. Congressman Waltz, who's going to be the national security advisor, who understands defense issues and national security issues very well. I hope that these are people who will help President Trump understand that sustained support for Ukraine is in American interests. Not only because of the humanitarian aspects of it, which I think are profound in and of themselves, but because of the connection of the war to this axis of aggressors. And what I believe is the fact that if Russia is able to accomplish its objectives in Ukraine, then what you will see is a further cascading of the crises that we've witnessed across the Middle East into the Indo-Pacific region as well. And I think that we'll see more direct threats to Europe. I mean, I think it's important, Roman, for President Trump, for everybody to understand, Russia is at war with us, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. Think about the shadow war in Europe. How about these unexplained, but we kind of know where they're coming from, incendiary bombs on DHL aircraft? How about attacks on European infrastructure? How about assassinations and cyber attacks and cyber-enabled information warfare? Russia is already at war with us and will continue to push until the Kremlin meets stiff resistance.
There are several options being discussed how this war might end. For example, the West German option. West Germany was part of NATO. There was a very large contingent of US, British, French forces on German soil, more than 500,000, I think. So NATO troops, also US nuclear weapons in Western Germany. Do you think it is something that Ukraine could hope for? Or is a South Korean model better or more realistic for Ukraine with a demilitarized zone? European troops, probably not the US troops. This is what we are reading in the US press, but still Western boots on the ground. What do you think is more realistic for Ukraine?
It's hard to say, but I just think that if Ukraine doesn't have the opportunity to regain a significant amount of its territory in the Donbass, it's going to be difficult for Ukraine to be a viable state from an economic perspective, as well as from securing itself against a continued Russian threat. Russia will revert back to various forms of subversion, the use of unconventional forces under the cover of conventional forces, much like it has done since 2014, between 2014 and 2022. Right? Russia didn't back off; it didn't adhere to previous agreements, and so I don't think it's realistic for us to think that would be the case this time. And so, if you leave Ukraine with kind of a rump state, Russia gets what it wants, because what it really wants is a servile relationship with Ukraine, and it would not, I don't think, it would not acquiesce to Ukrainian membership in NATO or Western troops in Ukraine without a continued effort to subvert Ukraine and subsume all of the territory, and to extinguish Ukraine as a nation. Much like Poland was extinguished in the beginning of World War II.
Ukraine has started an incursion into Russia in Kursk region in August. Do you think it has paid off?
I think so. I think it demonstrated how weak Russia is. And I think what you will see in the coming weeks is that the Russian and North Korean forces are going to impale themselves on prepared defenses. And I think that even if Ukraine has to trade space while they conduct those defensive operations, I believe they will inflict devastating losses on the Russians and North Koreans as they endeavor to take back that territory.
General Mark Milley, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has advised Ukraine in the fall 22 to think of negotiations to end this war. Ukraine was winning back then in Kharkiv and Kherson, in two regions. But the Ukrainian army commander, General Zaluzhny, said, no, we want all our land back. Do you think Ukraine has made a mistake?
Well, I think we made a mistake in not helping them build up the capacity they needed for a sustained counteroffensive, and recognizing that after the counterattack that occurred that regained so much of Ukrainian territory, that once the Russians were able to prepare defenses with natural obstacles and man-made obstacles and extensive minefields, and to organize those defenses with massive artillery and attack helicopters and electromagnetic warfare, that, hey, that's a whole different military problem. And we didn't do enough to help the Ukrainians develop the capabilities and the competencies. Why are we not helping Ukrainians train inside of Ukraine? Why? I mean, these few week-long training exercises are insufficient. Again, it gets back to that qualitative difference. It makes the biggest difference in close combat, whether you have the knowledge, skills, abilities, but really the confidence in your own ability to fight, but in your broader team's ability to conduct combined arms and joint operations, to create multiple dilemmas to that defending enemy, and to be able to strike that enemy in depth, paralyze those defenses, so you can create a penetration and turn them out of those defensive positions. That is the graduate level of warfare. And I don't think the Ukrainians took enough time, and we didn't give them enough support to be able to solve that most complex of operational and tactical problem sets.
Let's talk about Donald Trump's relation with Vladimir Putin and his attitude towards Russia. In your book, you describe an episode how in March 2018, President Trump wanted to congratulate President Putin on being re-elected. And this was shortly after the Skripal poisoning in the UK. And in a kind of memo for the president, you wrote, "Don't congratulate," in capital letters. This was leaked to the press. But President Trump didn't follow your advice. Why not?
Well, I knew he wasn't going to. And because the way President Trump operates is he tries to separate the relationship from the negotiation. And also, he's very attracted to a big deal, right? He's the self-described deal maker. So there's really, Roman, I don't see anything nefarious in it, but I also see that he wants to be regarded by our citizens here in the United States the way he thinks that Russians regard him as strong, so he's drawn to these sort of, these leaders who appear strong. I mean, I think actually Putin's weak. I mean, Putin is weak, but he's stronger than any organized opposition because he has more political prisoners in jail than at the height of the Cold War. That he has more people in his internal security forces than he does in his military. I mean, so Putin is not strong, but I think President Trump falls into the trap that others do, that Orban and some of these other sort of nationalist leaders who tend to be drawn to Putin as a strong leader, when in fact, I think he's abjectly weak.
But one more example. In your book, you write that at one point you told your wife that after over a year in the job of national security advisor, you, I quote, don't understand Putin's hold on Trump. So
Right.
what do you mean, and what's your possible explanation?
Well, it's just really what I told you. He has this drive for a deal, and then Putin knows how to play foreign leaders, not just Trump, but others, right? With the prospect of some kind of an entente. Donald, wouldn't it be great if we could work together on nuclear arms reduction? You know, wouldn't it be great if we could work together on terrorism? Wouldn't it be great? I mean, this is the laugher of all of them, the funniest of all, on cybersecurity, you know. So I mean, he pulls on Trump's strings, his desire for a big deal, you know, and so I think that's what happens. You know, it's flattery plus the prospect of this major deal with Putin, and again, this idea that we have that we can resurrect the diplomacy of the 1980s and 70s, and separate Russia, or the former Soviet Union, what was the Soviet Union, from China. Hey, Mao, I said Xi Jinping, Xi Jinping and Putin are intertwined, and instead of trying to separate them, we should glue them together, because when we pretend that they're separate, we allow them to cover for each other.
Yeah,
Rowan, I'm sorry, I think I have to go. I gotta go. Darn it. I have 1 minute.
okay. In the end, what is your major, you're a historian, military historian, what is your major lesson from this war for Ukraine, for the West, for NATO?
The major lesson is that weakness is provocative. It's much cheaper to prevent a war than to have to fight one. If you're concerned about the prospect of nuclear escalation, vertical escalation of a war, then prevent the war to begin with capable forward position forces. Europe has relearned that lesson. Germany has announced, Chancellor Scholz announced a Zeitenwende, but hey, it's time to follow up on that now. I mean, we have to stop pretending that these wars can't escalate horizontally and vertically. And we need to, go back to the old Ronald Reagan saying of peace through strength.
General H.R. McMaster, former National Security Advisor to Donald Trump, thank you very much for your time and your expertise.
Vielen Dank. Great to be with you, Roman.